Hello class, it's Professor Streeter, and in these videos I'm going to talk about the slides from the Week 5 slideshow. I walked you through them during class, but I know I moved pretty fast. I was trying to give you the bigger picture and show you the kind of the structure of the argument that Schaefer-Landau is making and the relationship between Chapter 7, Psychological Egoism, and Chapter 8, Ethical Egoism. But in these videos, I'm going to move a little more slowly through some of the slides. So let's get started. I'll make myself small again. And let's begin with the slide, The Egoism of Thomas Hobbes. He was an English philosopher who lived through the English Civil Wars and witnessed the execution of the king, right? Charles I was beheaded by those who opposed the monarchy. Hobbes was a loyalist to the monarchy, and so he left London and lived in Paris for a while and witnessed all of the discord and violence and of a civil war. And so he was interested in sort of how to avoid that. His philosophy was aimed at the political aim of ensuring peace and unity in a society. But his whole political and moral philosophy was based on the premise that individuals are psychological egoists, that everything they do is for the sake of self-interest. It was motivated by self-interest. He denied that there was a highest good that human beings seek. What we seek is happiness, that's a word, but all happiness is, according to Hobbes, is the individual pursuit and the restless and individual pursuit of the satisfaction of desire after desire after desire, which never ends, right? The desire to satisfy your desires never ends. And so the pursuit of happiness, right, doesn't end in some ultimate sort of satisfaction of like an ultimate desire. It's just a restless process of trying to satisfy as many desires as you can. And so that, again, that's a sort of claim that he makes about our biological nature. We are beings who are, instinctually or biologically inclined to just pursue the satisfaction of desire after desire after desire. And what do we desire? Well, he thought, again, sort of biologically or psychologically, we were inclined to desire lots of the same things. Recognition or fame or glory, power over each other, and goods, right? We were consumers, right? We wanted more stuff. So he thought in a state of nature, without any way to enforce the law, let's say, people were naturally inclined to try to get as much stuff as they could for themselves. And this would result in what he called a war of all against all. And so his goal was to try to understand, right, how do you convince individuals to sacrifice some of their liberty, some of their freedom to pursue their desires at will without concern for other people's interests? How do you get people to sacrifice some of their liberties and cooperate with each other? Because Hobbes recognized that from the point of view of self-interest, right, it is in all of our self-interest to cooperate with each other, but only if we can trust each other, right? I have an interest in reaching an agreement with you, not to harm you as long as you don't harm me, but right, or not to steal from you as long as you don't steal from me. But I have to be able to trust that you will hold up at your end of the bargain. And unless I have reason to trust that you'll hold up your end of the bargain, right, the self-interested thing is to break the agreement or to pretend to make an agreement with you and then go out and try to get as much stuff as I can for myself, right? And again, that he thinks results in what he calls a state of war, or a war of all against all. Then nobody benefits from that. Nobody benefits from being enemies to every other person. But so the problem was to show how do you convince people to trust each other enough to enter into agreements and contracts with each other and to cooperate with each other, right? Given that once those agreements are in place, right, they benefit everybody. And he thought that's why we needed what he called the Leviathan, right? A strong monarch or a strong authority that could enforce the contracts that we enter into with each other. So if someone breaks the contract, the Leviathan punishes that person, right? So there's consequences, right? So only with a strong monarch do we have a way of enforcing the contracts that we enter into with each other, which ultimately benefit each individual. So But anyway, that's the background for Hobbes and his egoism. But he doesn't think that anybody is, naturally or biologically inclined or psychologically inclined to do anything for the sake of other people, to sacrifice any of his interests or her interests for the sake of other people's interests. Right? I have to be sure. So altruism is not really possible. Of course, people will help each other in a civil society, but only because they see that it benefits them to cooperate with each other and help each other. So if I help you, you'll help me, for example. The understanding that helping each other is mutual, right? But only within that structure, right? Do I have a reason to be altruistic? Only if I have a reason to expect that other people will help me. Something along those lines is what Thomas Hobbes believed, and what he that kind of premise is what he appealed to in his defense of his moral positions and in his defense of his his political philosophy, right? What kind of government is best for restoring and maintaining peace and unity in society? And he thought a monarchy was best, as long as the monarchy embodied the will of the people. So Hobbes recognized that the monarchy can't rule independently of the people, right? So he tried to understand what it would mean for a strong monarch to embody the will of the people. And if it did, then the people have a self-interested reason to sacrifice some of their liberty, give up some of their personal liberty for the sake of serving the monarch, right? Or being a citizen in such a monarchy. Okay, so that's Hobbes. Just real quick, and I just wanted to introduce that idea, and we'll start moving more quickly now to Schaefer-Landau. But again, right, he gives you this example early in the chapter of a kind of an act of apparent altruism, where the soldier McGinnis sacrifices his life to save his fellow comrades, right? And there it doesn't seem like he is motivated by self-interest, right? It seems on the face of it that he is motivated purely by a concern for the interests of others. And so the psychological egoist, someone like Hobbes, is denying that that's what's really going on, right? Even in the case of McGinnis, right? He has to see that what he's doing in some sense serves his self-interest. And you can do that in a number of ways, right? For example, you could expand what the idea of self-interest involves, or you could try to understand self-interest in terms of his desire to avoid a guilty conscience, right? Or to be perceived as a hero after he dies, right? That's what's really motivating him. The desire for recognition, the desire for glory, right? Which you could argue is a self-interested motive. But so the psychological egoist has to explain what McGinnis does in those terms, right? And that's the view. Now, Schaefer-Landau, I think, gives us the example of McGinnis from Kennedy's book to suggest that, it's hard to swallow that pill, right? It's hard to accept the egoistic explanation as the best explanation for why McGinnis jumped on the grenade, right? There are many ways of explaining why he jumped on the grenade, and I think Schaefer-Landau gives us the example because it's hard to square with egoism. Of course, you might explain McGinnis's choice in egoistic terms, but is that the best explanation? Is that the most plausible explanation? Right? It seems like an altruistic motive is the more plausible explanation for explaining why he did what he did. Okay, so that's the debate that Schaefer-Landau sets up in chapter 7. And what I came to toward the end of the discussion of the slideshow in class is, what are the arguments for egoism? I talked a little bit about what's at stake in defending or rejecting psychological egoism, but what are the arguments? And let's start with this first one, right? Reasons for thinking that psychological egoism is true. Okay, so I'm just keeping track of time here. So here's the first one. It starts on page 97. It's called The Argument from Our Strongest Desires. Okay? And so the idea is, the first premise, the idea is that, look, every time you act, you're acting on your strongest desire. We have many desires, right? At any given time, you ask a person what she desires, right? You can give a list of many different things, right? But the idea here is that when we do something, what's motivating us every time we act is our strongest desire. But that's the first premise, right? That whenever you act, you're motivated by your strongest desire, right? Which isn't to say that's the only thing that you desire at that moment, but that it must be your strongest desire. Otherwise, it wouldn't you wouldn't have acted, right? Right. What gets you to act is your strongest desire. Okay, that's the first premise, right? We can think about whether that's true. The second premise is that whenever you're motivated by your strongest desire, you're pursuing your self-interest. That's just what it means to be motivated by your strongest desire, because in some sense your strongest desire is always yourself, to promote your self-interest. Okay. Now, so that's the second premise, and we can ask whether that's true. Notice that this is a valid argument. Right? If we accept premise 1 and we accept premise 2, then it does look like premise 3 follows, just logically. So everything hinges on whether we have any reason to accept the first two premises. Well, so looking at page 98, right? Schaefer-Landau thinks about some counterexamples to the first premise. Right? There's lots of times where you do something, right? But it's not something that you strongly desire to do, right? So he gives the example of visiting your relative, like your aunt, who keeps calling you or texting you saying you haven't visited me in years, I miss you. And maybe you don't really like your aunt, you don't have a good relationship with your aunt, but she very much wants to see you, and so you go to see her. Not because you have a strong desire to see her, but because you're just, I don't know, you're tired of getting these texts, and maybe you don't have anything better to do that day. And but anyway, I mean, like, there's lots of other things that you would rather be doing, but you go to visit your aunt, right? Because you feel like you ought to, maybe, or whatever. But it doesn't seem like it's something you strongly desire to do. Okay, he gives other examples of driving to work and sitting in traffic. Okay, maybe your strongest desire is to take the next exit and go have lunch, right? Because you're tired of sitting in traffic, but you need to get to work. Okay, and so you continue to sit in traffic, even though that's not an expression of your strongest desire. Now, he points out that the egoist can get around those kinds of examples. So you're staying in your commute because you have a strong desire to, like, I don't know, take care of your family. And if you don't get to work, you might get fired, and that would really mess up your life. Okay, so you're staying in your car, sitting in traffic, not because you have a strong desire to stay in traffic, but because you have a strong desire to keep your job and take care of your family. Okay, so the egoist could explain away those apparent counterexamples. But so then, right, Schaefer-Landau turns to the example of strictly conscientious action, right, where you do something because you think it's required of you, even though you have a strong temptation to do something else. You have a very strong desire to do something else, but you do, to go to lunch with a friend, right? But you keep your promise to visit your aunt because you feel like it's your duty to do so, or you're required to do it, right? And so it looks like an example of conscientious action, as he calls it. Your desires are pushing you in another direction, right? Your desire is pushing you in the direction of going and having lunch with friends, but duty calls, right? And so you go to visit your annoying aunt, in the nursing home or something. And his claim is that sometimes people don't follow their desires, right? They follow duty, or they follow their sense of moral necessity, like something is drawing me to my aunt, not desire, but something else. Okay. So now that's the example of conscientious action, right? Seems like a problem for premise 1. Okay? Unless you say that sometimes people are motivated by their desire to do their duty. So when you go to see your aunt, you're motivated by your strongest desire, your desire to do your duty. But that's a problem for premise 2. So I'm going to pause now, and we'll look at premise 2, that part of the argument, in the next video.